Okay, class. So for the second lesson today, we'll address volume 2 of Either Or, in which Kierkegaard looks into what he calls the ethical life, the life of self-reliant self-responsibility. And I'll begin by saying a couple things about the pseudonymous author of this man who initially we just know as B, and later we learn that he's a judge. His name is Williams, Judge William. And let's also take it back to that central issue of marriage, which, if you remember, is what is on Kierkegaard's mind as he's writing Either Or. And he sets up the book to be a kind of debate about the value of marriage. Now, A, writing from the aesthetic life, he says quite explicitly, if you want to live a life of enjoyment, do not get married. That's the worst thing you can possibly do. Because any relationship you're going to get into, eventually you're going to find that person incredibly boring, right? And so A's solution is you cycle through the girls, right? You keep having different relationships with different people, and that way you can kind of keep the enjoyment alive. And the first volume of Either Or ends with a section called The Diary of the Seducer. And A claims that this is not written by him, that he found it by some other guy, and that it spooks him a little bit. But the idea behind the seducer is somebody who is the serial seducer, who keeps going from one girl to another. It's there that Kierkegaard incorporates some of his own diary entries, and it's there where he insinuates that he is such a seducer and that he's basically used Regina. And as we said, he hopes to do so in order to deflect any shame away from Regina, but it has the opposite effect. Now let's see how the judge responds to this. The judge says, on one hand, I hear what you're saying, but the problem is you're approaching it all wrong. You're approaching other people as if they're just a source of entertainment and enjoyment and pleasure for you. But you're thereby cutting yourself off from one of the most enjoyable things in life, which is to have a committed relationship in which you really genuinely get to know somebody for who they are. And so the judge says, if you want to have a meaningful life, you need to have the sorts of responsibilities and the sorts of commitments that marriage represents. And he says, what A will never fully understand is that it's only within the ethical life where you are grounded solidly in self-responsibility that you can ever have any kind of real lasting enjoyment. And so the way that the judge wants to set it up is that actually there's nothing wrong with enjoyment. It's a valuable thing, right? It's not like this is the life of self-denial or something. It just shouldn't be your highest value. And in fact, the way that the judge sets this up is what the aesthetic person wants enjoyment, you can only really have if you live a life of self-responsibility, right? And again, he uses the example of marriage. He says, if you really want to have enjoyment and really want to have that sense of kind of lasting joy, you need to have a committed relationship, because it's really only then that you get to have that really intense personal experience of somebody else as who they are, rather than as merely a source of pleasure for you. And so you can see how more broadly, though, that's supposed to explain how the ethical life, in a sense, incorporates the aesthetic life, right? The idea is what you wanted from this life, enjoyment, you will only get once you despair of that. Sorry, I'm pointing to something that doesn't exist anymore. Once you despair of the aesthetic life and give it up and live the ethical life, only then will you really have lasting, comfortable enjoyment. Okay? Precisely because it's not your highest value, enjoyment is now a value that you can achieve since your life is grounded in a higher, more stable value. Okay, so now let's jump into the text that I gave you, where the judge is saying the ethical life, in contrast to the aesthetic life, is one in which you are active instead of passive, right? And the very first passage that I gave you brings out this sense of this kind of active approach to life. He says, for the eternal dignity of man lies in the fact that he can acquire a history, and the divine element in him lies in the fact that he himself can impart to this history a continuity, if he will. For it acquires that, not by being the sum of all that's happened to or befallen me, but by being my own work, so that even what has befallen me is transformed in me and translated from necessity to freedom. Now, as you probably notice, unlike A, who has these nice, kind of concise, witty little remarks, He's deliberately presented by Kierkegaard as kind of boring. He writes this very long, 100-page long letters to A. That's what volume 2 consists of. It was these very long, somewhat theoretical epistles that he is writing to A. But let's try to break down the language of what he's getting at. He's saying the dignity of us, and it's almost a kind of divine dignity, is the fact that the history of your life is not the history of things that happen to you passively, right? But instead, the history of things that you have actively chosen to do, right? And he says that's what gives us dignity. The fact that we have that free choice, we have that will, and the fact that we can forge a life for ourselves, we can control our lives to some extent, and we can take responsibility for our lives. That is what gives human life dignity, right? And so you can see, by implicit contrast, the idea is the aesthetic person, when they go through the history of life, they're going to say, yeah, this thing happened to me, and this other thing happened to me, and then this great thing happened, and this bad thing happened. But the judge says, really? That's the way you describe your life? When I describe my life, I talk about, here I accomplished this. Here I accomplished that. Here I failed in my accomplishments, but I learned from it, and I worked harder the next time. In other words, if you take a passive view of life, you end up living the aesthetic life, but the ethical way of life is one in which you are in the driver's seat of your own life. You take responsibility for forging the life that you yourself want to live, right? And this very much relates to an idea that we've talked a lot about in both Kant and Mill, and that's the idea of autonomy. When the judge talks about self-responsibility, really what he's getting at is a sort of autonomy in which you take charge of your own life and you forge and carve out a meaningful existence for yourself. So let's see how he thinks that is supposed to happen. One thing that you probably notice is he talks a lot about choice, and that's the key element here in the ethical life is choosing. And one thing that's somewhat strange is he says, among all the choices you make, the most fundamental one is you choose yourself. And I'll start out just trying to decipher that language, because you might think, how do I choose myself or not choose myself? I mean, I am myself either way, right? How is it that I can choose to be me, right? And how does that make any difference? Or if let's suppose I choose to be somebody else, how could I be anybody else? So let's try to understand what he means by that. Really what he means by choosing yourself is choosing to take responsibility for yourself. And there you can see somebody can either choose to take responsibility for how they live and be in the driver's seat, or somebody could try to avoid that responsibility and treat themselves as if they're just a string of things that are happening to them. That seems to be his critique of A, is that A isn't choosing himself. He's not being in the driver's seat. He's kind of sitting back and saying, hey, life is boring, right? There's all this stuff that's happening to me, but it's kind of boring. But the judge thinks the real problem here is not that life is boring, right? It's not a fact about the world that's plaguing you. It's the fact that you haven't stepped up to the plate and tried to live your own life according to your own choices. You've had an entirely passive approach, right? And another way he expresses that is he says, the aesthetic life is all about wishing, not willing, right? In the aesthetic life, you wish that things were better. You wish that things were entertaining, right? And then maybe you're disappointed that they're not. In contrast, the ethical person wills. They say, I will to live a responsible life. I will to live up to my responsibilities, my duties. I will to forge a meaningful, valuable, moral life for myself. Right? So, and this is what he means by choosing yourself, is taking that sort of active role, that kind of first step of approaching yourself in the mode of self-responsibility. Right? And I'll read to you what he says. This is on the second page of the volume 2 readings I gave for you. He says, this is on near the top of 543. The individual thus chooses himself as a diversely determined concretion, and chooses himself therefore in respect of his concretion. This concretion is the reality of the individual, but since it is in respect of his freedom that he chooses it, one can also say that it is his possibility, or to avoid such an aesthetic expression, that it is his task. So let's try to decipher this language here. You might think, wait a minute, I'm supposed to choose myself. Yeah, that sounds all good and fine, but aren't there a lot of things about myself that I don't choose, that are just facts about me? So for example, who my parents were, right? Or various, genetic information about me. I don't choose that. To some extent, it might be that, I was born with certain talents, right? That's not something I chose, right? Or it might be that I'm born with certain disabilities. Again, that doesn't seem to be something that I chose. So how can I choose myself given that there's a lot about myself that is not chosen? What the judge wants to show you is that even those things in your life that seem to be a matter of what he calls concretion or necessity, those things are just concrete facts about you. They seem to be kind of necessary facts about you. The idea is if you approach them in the right way, in the mode of self-responsibility, you can transform them from things that are essentially merely necessity into things that are a matter of freedom and choice. Right? So let's try to give an example of this. Let's suppose that I find myself, I'm just the kind of guy, I tend to be late for stuff. If I was living the aesthetic life, I had a kind of passive approach. I would just think, yeah, that's just a fact of myself. I'm that guy, I'm kind of late, right? Or to give another more serious example, let's suppose I say, my parents never brought me up to be a nice guy, so, I'm kind of a jerk. It's just a fact about me. I'm just a jerk. The judge would say, really? That's just a fact about you? No. At every single moment, you are choosing to relate to that fact about yourself as something that's merely a passive fact about yourself or something that you can relate to actively. So yeah, it might be that your parents never brought you up to be a better person, to be the kind of person who shows up on time or isn't a total jerk. But you can relate to that fact as something that you now want to change and work to improve upon, right? And so even that bare fact about you, right, is something that you can transform from being a mere fact into a fact that you're trying to change or relate to or improve on, right? Same thing with things like, say, a talent, right? Some people are born with certain talents. The judge would say, that alone is not going to give your life meaning, right? To simply relate to yourself as somebody who has this inborn talent. The question is, what are you going to do with that talent, right? Are you going to cultivate that talent? Are you going to put in the time and the effort to practice that talent, to be able to do something great and accomplish great things, right? Or are you just going to relate to it as just some kind of fact about yourself, right, that you're proud of, that you were born with this sort of talent? So too with negative things like disabilities. The judge would say, it might be that you are born with certain disabilities that are simply a fact about you, that you in no way chose. But it is still your choice how you deal with and approach those disabilities, right? Are you going to let them get you down and give up on life? Or are you going to try to transform yourself into somebody who achieves things despite those disabilities? That is in your control. But because that's in your control, you can take that thing that's merely a contingent fact, a concrete fact about you, and you can transform it from a matter of merely a kind of factual concretion into a matter of freedom, simply by taking responsibility for how you respond to that fact about yourself. Okay? So this is what he means by choosing yourself. It's entering into that fundamental mode of self-responsibility where you approach your life through the orientation of wanting to and willing to take responsibility for yourself and how your life goes. Okay. So another thing that he talks about is, what if you make mistakes in life? Right? What if you try to live an ethical life, but you make some mistakes, right? Maybe you wanted to not be a jerk, and yet something just slipped out of your mouth, and you're still a jerk. Does that mean that you've utterly failed? The judge says no. You simply reapply this lesson about self-responsibility and self-reliance, and you can see that even that mistake you made is now something that you can relate to actively through willing, right? Namely by trying to improve yourself, right? How can you do better next time? Right? Or in the case of, let's say I hurt somebody's feelings, I can apologize, right? I can go into that active mode and try to make it better and try to make myself better, right? So this is, he says, this is on the bottom of 543. The person who lives ethically will try to choose his place rightly, but if he notices he's chosen wrongly or that obstacles arise over which he has no control, he does not lose courage, for he never surrenders his sovereignty over himself. He at once sees his task and is therefore instantly active. So as he floats earlier, he says one way you can think of it is that the ethical person always sees that possibility of improvement, that possibility of making things better. But since possibility was already that term that A used in talking about the aesthetic life, he says, I'm going to avoid such an aesthetic phrase. Instead, I'm not going to talk about how this is your possibility, but instead your task. Right? So he says the idea is at every moment you can look at your life as a matter of a task. You have a task to improve yourself, to do better. So if I made a mistake, instead of being like, well, I made a mistake, nothing I can do about it, instead I say, no, even my mistake is the new task. How do I improve? Right? How do I do better? Okay. And as a result, What the judge says is the ethical life has a security to it, a stability to it, that the aesthetic life doesn't. Precisely because the person living the aesthetic life is dependent upon the outside world, and if that world is boring, then this person says, okay, all is lost, life is meaningless, I found the world boring, right? But that's a matter of dependency. Instead, living the ethical life, precisely because it's a matter of self-reliance, where I rely not on the world, but on myself, right? I don't wish for things, but I will them. Instead, you have a sense of independence, right? Where if I so will it, I can be a good person, right? And hopefully, again, this is, if you were with me in the Socrates classes and ringing a bell, this is very much the Stoic position and very much the Socratic position. Socrates thought, no one can harm a good man, meaning you yourself can harm yourself by being a bad person. But if you will to be a good person, and that's your highest goal in life, nobody can prevent that from happening. That is within each person's will, right? And therefore, somebody who's living this ethical life where what you want most is to be a self-responsible person, nobody and nothing in the world can take that away from you. And that independence, that self-reliance, the fact that it relies solely on you, gives that life an infinite security within itself, the judge says. Right? And so instead of constantly worrying about whether the world will be enjoyable or not, as we did in the aesthetic life, in the ethical life, you have this absolute solidity within yourself, that you know that if you so will it, and if you take responsibility for yourself, you can make yourself into that good person who is fulfilling their duties. The next thing to talk about is the idea of duties. The judge says, oftentimes when we talk about the ethical life, people float this idea of duty as something that is objective and universal. And he says it's almost as if they want to discredit the ethical life. That sounds so horrible, right? He clearly has Kant in his sights here. He thinks, that kind of ethical life that Kant sells you, where you become entirely objective and you divest yourself of anything that you're passionate about or interested in. You set aside all your own experiences and desires and in relationships and upbringing, and instead, in a purely objective mode, you choose what is right. The judge says, that sounds awful, right? And that's not really the ethical life. And so he wants to instead forge a sort of alternate conception of duty, where it incorporates the notion that duty is universal, but the judge wants to turn that sense of universality around and change it in ways that are very much opposed to what Kant had envisioned. So let's talk about that now. So let's begin with this question of knowledge, which is one of the main things that preoccupied thinkers like Kant and to some extent Mill as well, which is, how do I know what my duties are? And if you remember, it was one of the standard greatest goals of the Enlightenment to be able to give you that principle by which you could always tell what are my duties. From the perspective of somebody like Judge William, once I enter into this orientation of self-responsibility towards my own life, the problem of knowledge, the problem of knowing what my duties are, essentially goes away. Because if I have that sense of I want to be a responsible person, the judge thinks I will automatically be able to see within various roles that I have a whole range of duties that I have, right? And he thinks it's not really so much a mystery what people ought to do. The real problem is just, do they have that orientation of commitment and self-reliant self-responsibility or not? But he thinks once I approach life with that orientation of self-responsibility, I will immediately see what my duties are. But in contrast to Kant, he thinks what my duties are will quite often be quite different from what anybody else's duties are. So the judge, for example, he talks about himself as a father and as a husband and as a judge. And he says, in each of these things, I see what my duties are, right? I have certain duties as a father to take care of my children. I have certain duties as a husband to take care of my wife. I have certain duties as a judge, professional duties, right? Other people might not have those same duties, but in each person's life, they will find, if they have that right orientation, they will find what their duties are, right? So the judge essentially denies the idea that knowledge is a problem in the realm of ethics. He thinks the real problem is just whether you have that passionate orientation of self-responsibility. And he thinks, if so, it will be clear to you when you look at what roles you have, what your duties are. Now, from that, it might seem like, okay, so then he's doing away with the concept of the universal. Or if my duties differ from your duties, it seems like, okay, everybody has their own duties, and duties and ethics are not universal after all, contrary to Kant. But this is not really where the judge is going. Instead, he wants to say, think about how, while my duties differ from your duties, duties and somebody else's duties, each person has that duty to fulfill whatever duties and responsibilities they have. So in a sense, there is a universal duty, namely, be yourself, fulfill the duties that you have and whatever roles that you have in life, right? And this is why later on he talks about, he says, for example, he's talking about the universal as the paradigm man. And he's saying, look, to be that universal person, right, that paradigm person, that kind of ethical hero, right, it's not required of you that you divest yourself of your particularity, the kind of thing that Kant wanted, where you were objective and you set aside everything particular about yourself. And in that mode of objectivity, you do what is right. He says, instead, you do exactly the opposite. You dive right into your subjectivity, and you dive right into what makes you the particular person that you are, and therein you will find your duties, right? So he says, everyone can, if he wants, become a paradigm man, not by wiping out his contingency, but by remaining in it and ennobling it. But he ennobles it by choosing it, right? And so again, what he means by ennobling it by choosing it is, when I dive into the particular roles that I have in life with the mode of self-reliance and self-responsibility, I will see and then fulfill all the various duties that I have, and then I will be the paradigm man, right? But it might be that I look very different from the next paradigm man who dives into the duties they find in their lives, right? But you can see how each person, though, still has that fundamental universal duty to fulfill their responsibilities in life, right? And each person who does that becomes, in essence, that universal man, that paradigm man, right? So there isn't one kind of cookie-cutter approach to ethics, but rather each person's life will be different, and therefore each person's duties will be different, but we can all attain what he calls the universal by fulfilling whatever duties we find in our lives. Right, and then the last thing to talk about is the concept of self-improvement, because the way that the judge presents this idea of the ethical life as a life of choosing yourself, it seems a lot like it's a matter of kind of momentary choice, where once I choose to be a responsible person, then it's all clear what my duties are, and I just need to fulfill them, right? And I can find those duties within myself. But it's important to see that for Kierkegaard, or at least for the judge here, there is a sense in which if I'm trying to improve myself to be a better form of myself, it does seem like I'm reaching for something beyond myself, right? Because I'm not yet the perfected person. I'm not yet the fully responsible, fully ethical person. If I'm making mistakes, which I probably am, there's a lot of things I need to improve on. So how then do I relate to this ideal version of me that I am not yet? It seems like, once again, I'm relating to something outside of me, and then where is the self-reliance? And this is the way he addresses this. And I asked you about it in the reading questions when he talks about the shadow. He says, in the morning, your shadow seems to be out in front of you. And then at noontime, it seems like you're standing above it. And the evening, it's behind you. What does that mean? That's his metaphor for the fact that in the beginning, when I set out to be an ethical person, that good ethical person, right, I want to be that ideal version of myself. And that seems to be ahead of me, right? But on the other hand, as I'm striving to be that person, as I'm fulfilling my duties, eventually I'm there. Eventually I'm that person I wanted to be, right? And it might even be that eventually I'm beyond that. I'm now choosing new duties, new aspirations to be an even better person, right? So in a sense, that original sense of my ideal self is now behind me, right? But either way, the idea is it's still your shadow, right? It is still particular to you, whatever this ethical version that is still particular to you. Okay, so for your reflections, I want you to begin by weighing in on Kant versus Kierkegaard here, or Kant versus Judge William. Do you agree that once you enter into life with that orientation of self-responsibility, that all your duties will be clear, and that ethics then is not really a matter of knowing what your duties are, but simply having that passion to fulfill them? And then second of all, do you agree with the judge that once I enter that way of life, and I am self-reliant, that gives me a kind of security within myself that will make me have a meaningful, fulfilled life, right? Or do you think that something's wrong here with this critique, that this person living an aesthetic life is living a dependent life, and therefore they'll never be happy. They'll always have that kind of anxiety of that dependency of not having the world be the world they wanted it to be.